Whenever you're ready. Oh, good. Good afternoon. Welcome all to Independent Sector's monthly policy update for January in the year 2021. I see folks are gathering, folks are joining. I'm going to give people 30 more seconds as people are logging in, and we will get started right away. So I'm Ben Kershaw. I'm the Director of Public Policy and Government Relations at Independent Sector. For those of you who are joining us for the very first time on an IS webinar, welcome. Independent Sector is a national membership organization representing a set of nonprofits, foundations, and corporate giving programs working to ensure that all people in the United States thrive. As part of our webinar feature, all lines are currently muted. We will pause periodically for questions. Please type those in the Q&A box if you can. You can also email publicpolicy@independentsector.org. We'll record this webinar, post it on our website, and email you next week. So before we start, I want to respectfully acknowledge I'm joining you today from Washington, D.C., the ancestral home of the Piscataway people who are still in the area working to reclaim their land and traditional practices. I also want to acknowledge many of the buildings and places we inhabit in Washington were built by enslaved people. Wherever you're joining us from, we're really glad to have you with us. These sorts of policy education events have historically been a benefit for independent sector members, but during this pandemic, we have opened them up to non-members as well through March of this year. We want to ensure that all of the charitable sector has access to the latest policy information at this critical time. I'm joined by Jessica Cameron and Wes Coulomb from Washington Council Ernst Young, our trusted partners today, and also by my government relations partner in crime at IS, Ana Montañez. This is usually the part of the program where we look forward to what is on the horizon and what's happening in Congress. But due to Congress getting their Christmas shopping done at the very last minute last year, we as a group have not discussed the December major legislation that passed. Certainly since then, I'm not breaking any news that Congress passed major COVID relief and appropriations legislation at the end of the year, but we do want to start with that. This was a $900 billion COVID relief package, a $1.4 trillion fiscal year 2021 spending bill, and a combination of other tax extensions and policy provisions. It is the longest bill I have ever read or read in my time watching Congress, close to 6,000 pages. So there are a lot of highlights from that bill, and the most important thing that you can do if you haven't seen it already is to check out the highlights for the nonprofit sector that Independent Sector summarized in the hours after that bill's release. I want to flag a few key things. This bill offers another round of Paycheck Protection Program funding for the hardest hit nonprofit organizations. Access to this lifeline is not nearly as broad as our sector has requested, but there were advocacy efforts in the final days that eliminated some really onerous barriers that could have excluded nonprofits disproportionately. So we continue to work on improvements to that program. We'll talk more about that. This bill expanded the universal charitable deduction very slightly to allow it to be $600 per couple, and extended it through the year 2021, again, far short of what we requested. The legislation extended and expanded a credit for retaining employees, which is important for organizations that do not access the Paycheck Protection Program in particular. And that legislation also made really important investments in our civic and our community infrastructure. A lot of the priorities that the nonprofit infrastructure investment advocacy group for these include improved access to broadband internet, child care support, stabilization for the Postal Service, as well as funding for transit agencies. So certainly not the legislation we wanted to end the year, but I know given where things were the last time we all spoke on this Zoom call, we were pleased to get some of that. And so now here we are in the year 2021, and we are talking about COVID relief urgently again. I hope you all got a lot of rest over the holidays. The President Biden, has released his initial proposal to Congress, and I now want to go to Anna for some details about that proposal.
Thank you, Ben. Yeah, indeed, President Biden on January 14 announced his 1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan, which is the first step in a two-step plan of rescue and recovery. The plan includes more than $400 billion to combat the pandemic through a national vaccination program, increased testing and tracing, and adds additional funding to help schools reopen safely, along with very much needed funding for states and local governments experiencing budget shortfalls. That includes $350 billion for that. It also includes $1,400 as direct payments for individuals, enhanced unemployment benefits, federally mandated paid leave, and various other supports for individuals, small businesses, and communities. Unfortunately, President Biden's rescue plans leaves out some of the relief for charities priorities we've been advocating during the past year. For example, the plan doesn't include any specifics on the expansion and extension of the charitable giving incentives, and it is silent regarding increasing the reimbursement percentage for nonprofits who pay unemployment insurance. Regarding funding for small businesses, Biden's plan includes $15 billion in flexible, equitable, and distributed grants. That being said, it is unclear if these grants will also apply to nonprofits. The plan gives no specifics as to how the money would be applied to the Paycheck Protection Program versus the economic injury disaster loans, nor it speaks as to what are the requirements that nonprofits and small business needs to fulfill to access this funding. Additionally, the rescue plan includes $35 billion for government funds for successful state, local, tribal, nonprofits, and small business financing programs. But because these are loans, they're unlikely to meet nonprofit needs. And that's why on January 22nd, at the time, 75 nonprofits sent a letter addressed to President Biden and congressional leadership, urging them to recognize the unique role of charitable nonprofits in improving the pandemic relief and economic recovery. So we're gonna leave you on the chat the link. So if you're interested in signing up to this letter, the letter is still open. So we'll include that link on the chat. Thank you, Ben.
Thank you, Anna. Yes, that letter is open. We encourage folks to sign, and please share with your networks. This similar version of this letter had over 4,000 signatures last year, and we need this strength in numbers to continue to make our case to Congress. Speaking of Congress, there is a lot of sort of first day of school type stuff happening around Capitol Hill right now. Maybe not quite the excitement of first day of school given all that's gone on in our country lately. But Wes and Jessica, we're very glad to have you with us. What can you tell us about the landscape on Capitol Hill right now and what nonprofits should be tracking?
Yeah, I'll have Jessica kick it off. Go ahead, and Jessica, I'll fill in.
Thanks, Wes and Ben. And you're right, Ben, it's definitely not as fun as going back to school shopping and going back to school. But there's a lot going on that is important for all of you to have on your radar. So kind of just to go back a little bit to earlier in January, of course, we now have some personnel changes in the government. We have a new president, President Biden, who was sworn in on January 20th. We also have in Congress a new majority within the Senate. With the recent Georgia elections, Democrats now have the majority in both the House and the Senate. However, very important to note is that Democrats have very narrow majorities in both chambers, and specifically within the Senate, it's actually down to a 50-50 split, with Vice President Harris being the tiebreaker as the last vote. So why is this important? It's important because Democrats, if they want to pass any of Biden's priorities that he's talked about during the campaign, there's really no room for error as far as getting legislation off the finish line, especially in the Senate. And in fact, we've seen recently several absences, temporary ones from certain senators, either because of hospitalizations or because of quarantining due to COVID exposure. That really shows how shaky that number is and how tight and narrow that majority really is. So what are they working on? Anna did a great presentation and kind of rundown of the different pieces of the American Rescue Plan, which is Biden's proposal, that $1.9 trillion proposal that he'd like to get through Congress to help shore up the economy and help with combat the pandemic. The question will really be, how does this get passed and when? And so there are current efforts that Biden has indicated he'd like to do something on a bipartisan basis. And in fact, in the Senate, there is a group of senators, calling them the Sweet 16, because there are 16 senators, that are trying to work on some type of agreement between Republicans and Democrats. So far, as you can would likely guess, it's not going particularly well, although they continue to meet and discuss potential options. And so while they are doing that, and remember too that if something passes through the Senate with tax changes, that means they need 60 votes in order for that to pass, not just 51. Meaning that they would also need Republican support, not just Democratic support, to pass the bill. So more likely will be that the bill will go through what's called reconciliation, which I know we've talked about on these calls before, which essentially just allows the Democrats to pass a bill through with only 51 votes. And there are a number of rules attached to that plan. So complicating things, I should say, in addition, is that the impeachment trial of former President Trump is set to begin on February 8th. And so that will go on for several days, hearing arguments from both sides. And as a result, while that's a very important trial for a lot of senators to wade through the arguments and to hear all the evidence, it does mean that it delays any efforts to pass this kind of relief bill, something that Biden has been very focused on within his legislative agenda. So I'll stop there as far as kind of that stimulus plan, and note that down the line, there are also some other efforts that Biden has that he would like to move forward with, particularly after a stimulus bill. The hope of the Biden administration is to do something on some type of large infrastructure bill, focusing on a lot of his key priorities during the campaign, including things like green energy, mass transit, as well as increase in employment in those types of industries. I think the real question will be how this stimulus bill that's kind of being worked through right now, when and how that will get passed, and then when they can then move on to some type of infrastructure bill. Again, just like with the stimulus bill, because of the way that the Senate is currently made up between Democrats and Republicans, it's likely that they'll need some type of additional reconciliation bill in order to get that passed. And I know that for independent sector and for a lot of the sector's members, there's some key priorities that they've been working on, hopefully to kind of move forward in that particular bill or those negotiations. Finally, before I turn it over to Wes, kind of some other things to put on your radar. Down on 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, where President Biden is, there has been no shortage of work that the administration has been doing separate and apart from Congress. Again, remember that Congress has these narrow majorities, and so as a result, Biden has really hit the ground running with a number of executive orders, doing a number of different things to either reverse certain Trump policies that he made during the Trump administration, as well as some organizing executive orders. For example, there have been ones dealing with rejoining the Paris climate agreement, reviewing government procurement contracts for pandemic-related instances, mask mandate on federal lands, as well as one on focusing on racial equity, diversity, and inclusion efforts. So lots of work, not just on Congress, but also within the administration. But I'll turn it over to Wes and see if he has anything else in addition to add to that.
That's a good summary, Jessica, of kind of where things are. Just a little more color maybe on some of the timing behind the scenes efforts. As you know, with the 50-50 Senate, they have to then organize the Senate and realign the committees, et cetera. They have not yet agreed to that resolution. So the committees are still technically under the control of the Republicans. Have you seen them chairing hearings on nominations, what the Senate's been trying to do, and kind of why they delayed the impeachment trial? One, to give more time both sides to file their briefs, but also helps President Biden get some nominations done this week and next before they turn their time over to the impeachment. And so, given the 50-50 narrow margin, they have to agree to who shares power and how it works out. So, Leader Schumer and Leader McConnell have, I think, come to an agreement, and we should hear that announcement sometime in the next 24 to 48 hours, is my guess, before the end of the week, on how that shakes out. Basically, I think that the model is 2001 when they had a 50-50 Senate back with Senator Lott, Senator Daschle, and it was the committee ratios were even. The chairmanships were controlled by the Democrats since they have the vice president break the tie, and then you have the ability to bring legislation to the floor under certain circumstances, under certain rules, if it is a tie vote. So it's going to be, as Jacob points out, a very narrow Congress, which points to where President Biden has been and trying to do something through executive order, and a lot of administrative actions. We'll probably see more of that over the next course of this year. So just a little bit on timing. I think that the sense is that although the Democrats, including Senator Schumer, have indicated they want to do a bipartisan package for relief, indications over the weekend with some conversation between administration officials and some of the moderate Republicans is the Biden's plan is just too expensive, too much for them to get 10 votes. And even on a bipartisan basis with some, number of moderate Republicans just can't swallow it. So it looks to me like they're not going to be able to do a bipartisan bill. So they're really looking to go down this path of reconciliation to move it through on a more partisan basis that requires only 51 votes. In order to do that, they must pass a budget resolution first. And so we understand the committees are working on that this week and into next week in the House and Senate to pass a budget resolution potentially as early as next week to then set up for a reconciliation bill after the impeachment trial is over in the Senate in February. So that's kind of, I think, where things are lining up at the moment.
Great, thank you. Thank you both very much. You both kind of touched on this, the desire for a bipartisan bill. Certainly we've heard a lot about unity and a lot of discussion about what unity means and what it doesn't mean over the last couple of weeks. And I think that's something we'll all be following closely. This note about 60 votes is important because the quotes that we're seeing from moderate Republicans are from the Romneys and Murkowskis, and we all think of Susan Collins in that vein, but that list of so-called people who get described as moderate Republicans, certainly a lot in the press, it doesn't get you to 10 votes, right? And so there's, I think bipartisan deal making is, I would just want to underscore that it's not just Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski who can make a deal happen. But on that front, if we are turning to reconciliation and thinking about further COVID relief, reconciliation is not just a free pass to pass anything you want with 51 votes. That impacts the substance of what can get passed. Can you give us some thinking about how the reconciliation procedural tools might impact the contents of a package? I know that's a few steps down the road, but I think it's important for us all to be thinking about.
That's a really good point. And reconciliation was just, originally created as a tool to pass through difficult deficit reducing measures such as tax increases and spending cuts. But it's been of late used mostly to cut taxes in past Republican Congresses. And so basically how it works is the budget resolution lays out kind of the budget parameters for the overall budget, and then gives instructions to one or more committees in the House and the Senate to meet a revenue or spending target. So let's just keep on the tax front, for example. It would instruct the Ways and Means Committee in the House and the Senate Finance Committee in the Senate to say cut taxes by $500 billion as a way to help pay for part of the Biden plan. And then they would have to then write a bill that met that number. The bill itself couldn't increase the deficit beyond that number, and it couldn't increase the deficit beyond that number outside the 10-year budget window. And you also can't include provisions in there that are non-budgetary in nature, such as, for example, they would talk about minimum wage increase as a provision that would probably not be allowed under reconciliation because it's not a provision that would raise revenue or cut taxes or increase or decrease spending. Basically, it's a change in how employers pay their employees, and therefore it's incidental or indirect benefits to the government are not enough to deem it to be a real budgetary provision. And so that would have to kind of meet strict rules and reconciliation to do that. Other administrative rules like regulations and guidance and notices and transparency provisions, that sort of thing, would also fall out of the reconciliation because it didn't have a budget or revenue cost. And so reconciliation has its pros in the sense that you can pass things through on an expedited basis, 20 hours of debate in the Senate, a guaranteed vote on a simple majority vote, 51 votes rather than 60, as the Senate usually requires for legislation. But you have to then, take out things that aren't budgetary in nature. Direct tax increases are fine, but direction to Treasury to do guidance or administrative actions or notices wouldn't qualify. So it limits their ability to do certain things in the bill, and that's kind of what they're looking at. But I just also want to make a point that just because it's under reconciliation doesn't mean it has to be partisan. Sure, 60 votes is tough to get in the Senate, but if the Democrats wanted to draft a bill that say, met with some support from Senator Collins or Murkowski or Romney, for example, because if I was Senator Manchin or a couple other more, moderate, maybe vulnerable Democrats, I would want to have some cover from Republicans on that bill. And so it's likely to be partisan and only Democrats support it. But if they wanted to put some provision in there that were a little more lean to the Republican side, they could capture a few votes. For example, Susan Collins voted for President Obama's recovery bill in 2009. Her and Senator Snow were the only two Republicans that voted for, if I recall. I think maybe Senator Specter did as well. But so, there's a possibility to do that on a narrow bipartisan basis rather than a full 10 Republicans. But my sense is that's where it's going, is reconciliation is kind of what they're going to do in order to get it passed, because they really can't, or really are not likely to get 10 votes what they want to do.
And Wes mentioned one of those provisions that may be on shaky ground under reconciliation, and that would be the increase in the minimum wage, which is something that Biden has proposed. Another kind of area that could be questionable is aid to state and local governments, which again is another top priority for Democrats. So, there definitely are some huge kind of loopholes that that the Democrats are really going to have to go through in order to move this through reconciliation.
Thank you both. Jessica, you mentioned that there's new personnel in the administration because it's a new administration. One of those people with a new business card is Janet Yellen, who's now Treasury Secretary. Is there anything that the nonprofit sector, ought to be thinking about in terms of her background or her confirmation process? New things that came to light along those lines that we should be watching and activating on?
Yeah, definitely. There are a few things to know about now Secretary Yellen. The first maybe to mention is that she's the first female Treasury Secretary, which is a very notable thing to a notable personnel change within the administration. The second one is that, where we often talk about the sector is within the realms of tax policy, since that's where a lot of the rules and regulations kind of guide the sector. With regards to Secretary Yellen, she's someone that came from the Federal Reserve, has clearly a deep background in economics and in financial institutions, and is incredibly qualified in those particular areas. But compared to the previous Secretary Mnuchin, who I think took a very strong interest in those tax policy pieces, Yellen is I would say not as focused on those areas. And as a result, it's going to be really important, I think, or more important, to look at who will ultimately be the head of the Office of Tax Policy going forward. I think that role will be even more important with a secretary that's not as focused on those areas. With regards to her, her hearing, I'd mentioned she had mentioned particular issues regarding DAFs within her QFRs that she was asked about, as well as looking at the charitable deduction. I think she is clearly someone who knows the rules of the road and knows about confirmation hearings. And so as far as specific issues of how she would deal with those particular areas and others, remains to be seen. Although I will point out, she did mention in her QFR answers something particularly noteworthy, which was, that noting that the charitable deduction has been one factor in increasing charitable donations to the sector, and that she would kind of look at holistically at that area. I don't know if Wes, you have anything else, any other thoughts, but that kind of gives a general picture of her work.
No, that's great. That's a good summary of kind of where things are with Treasury. So obviously looking more to see how she feels about her staff underneath that and how we kind of engage with them. But I think, we'll keep an eye on that as well.
Great, thank you. Yeah, thank you, Jessica, for flagging those questions for the record, right? Those QFRs, questions for the record. Touching on a couple issues, key importance to us. Not quite providing much substance yet. So we have, before we turn away from COVID relief, for the moment, I want to look at the Q&A. One of our attendees, whose name I don't have, is asking about the eligibility for organizations organized for research or for engaging in advocacy in areas like public policy or political strategy. I think it's possible that this question is getting at the expansion of eligibility to 501c6s, but that is that's my guess. Wes or Jessica, do you have any sense of how this is going to shake out, or should we loop back with this person?
Yeah, I don't know exactly what they're getting as far as like the current rules, if they want some interpretation there. But one thing of note, Senator Whitehouse at the hearing did ask Senator Yellen and raised a question about dark money and about looking at examining 501c qualifications. I think it was more in the context of politics rather than charitable activities, but that has been raised, and he, I think, intends to follow up with her on that issue with Iris and Treasury. She didn't have much of a response other than to say she'd work with them on that issue. But so if that's kind of where he's going at, then there is interest from at least one senator on the Senate Finance Committee looking at that. Not sure where that will go or how that will transition to legislation, or more just back and forth between the IRS and Congress, and if that would be taken up. But there is, I think, that area of interest, at least from that part of the Senate Finance Committee. If that's helpful.
Great. Yes, thank you. And yeah, Tom, we look forward to catching up offline. We may have more. I'm sure we have more information for you. SBA is under tremendous need to issue further clarifications and guidance. So I have one more question, sticking with our friends from Washington Council, pivoting on to a slightly different topic, but one that is important for the whole charitable sector. Before I do that, I want to just make sure we don't have any other questions. This won't be your last chance pepper our team here. So the other issue that we've seen recently, in the wake of the insurrection on the Capitol grounds, is as profound as the impact is on our national psyche and our democracy, it also has the potential to impact our charitable sector. We've seen the incoming head of the Finance Committee and the current chair of the Ways and Means Committee both penned quite colorful letters to the administration about addressing this. What can you tell us or speculate, Washington Council, about what direction this might go in, and how, if you've got any thought on it, how we nonprofits ought to be thinking and organizing on?
Yeah, it's a good question. Just going to give a little more background. So Senator Wyden and Senator Chairman Neal, similar to IRS commissioner, asked him to look into Texas organizations that were involved in the riots and breach at the Capitol on January 6th, and their involvement either in promoting it or funding people or other organizations, and that sort of thing. Wanted to do a report on those activities. I think the Republicans are going to respond by saying, well, let's include all organizations and all activities, including some of the activities that happened over the course of the summer and the violence that took place in other parts of the country, and what organizations were involved in those, if there were other nonprofits and so forth. So I think that this will probably be an investigation that will happen mostly internally between the committee and the IRS in that report. I'd imagine, given the nature of what they're looking at, would probably likely be confidential. Maybe at some point they will release something that they could publicly put out, and maybe Senator Wyden, who become chairman of the Finance Committee, will hold a hearing on the issue. I don't see that on the horizon at the moment, all that they have on their plate, but maybe at some point that comes to fruition. But like I said, that'll probably be expanded to include other broader activities and groups. And so, I think that we need to kind of keep a watch of that and see where that goes next. But the first step here is the IRS then respond to that letter and do something in response to that and see where that goes next. And maybe it will just, end up in the Finance Committee offices and not go beyond that, or maybe it'll do a hearing, or maybe it'll do more public comments on it. We'll have to see, but it sounds like it's something that Senator Wyden is going to pursue at some level.
Great, thank you. Certainly, someone in Senator Wyden who thinks about the nonprofit sector a fair amount and nonprofit oversight in particular. So we have every confidence that he and his staff will be thoughtful on that. So I'm going to turn to a few other important updates now. But we will pause again for questions about these updates and about what else we have discussed so far. Jessica mentioned that President Biden signed a lot of executive orders in his first week and a day in the White House. I would note, she mentioned diversity. One of the executive orders signed on day one it seeks to advance racial equity and rescinds the quite alarming, disturbing. We've got a lot of adjectives for it. We had a whole webinar last year where we tried out adjectives for this executive order, banning diversity training by federal contractors and seeking to crack down on it for federal grant recipients. So that executive order, which was stayed in the courts, has now been rescinded. Just one more thing we can move on from. We did want to flag that in particular. In terms of the further tracking the health of the nonprofit sector, our friends and allies at the Johns Hopkins Center for Civil Society have been releasing monthly job totals for the nonprofit sector, which had been recovering from the depths of the economic crisis until the month of December, when we saw a loss of over 50,000 nonprofit jobs. These lost jobs included, significantly higher percentages of workers in arts and entertainment, education workers, and workers in religious grant making and civic associations. The nonprofit workforce is still down by over 900,000 jobs compared to COVID levels. So as much as the burden and the demand for nonprofit work has increased, the number of people performing that work for Americans in need, it has gone down. So that's something that I think all of us advocating are keeping in mind. Also, I would note that earlier this month, in the sort of the most scintillating of topics we saved for last, I want to flag that independent sector submitted public comments about Form 990 for nonprofits, and other information returns for nonprofits. These are not comments that I recommend bringing to the beach, but important statement about access to information about nonprofits. Independent sector and others worked hard for a number of years to get 990 information returns filed electronically. That is now the law of the land, but access to that information remains complicated. Also, the way the form is organized has left our sector, in particular those who seek to understand our sector better, with an incomplete picture of government revenue. And so, we and partners have recommended some changes to the form and to procedures surrounding the form in order to enhance public access to that information and enhance public understanding of that information. So I did want to note that. I will pause now to take all your questions about Form 990 comments. In all seriousness, we're happy to take a moment to go back to any of the congressional landscape questions or new administration questions. I have one final question for our friends at Washington Council, if not, but I will give people a moment to jump in on COVID relief. Okay. As we start to look forward, maybe beyond COVID relief, Jessica mentioned infrastructure. There's also something that is often in a normal year the centerpiece of the calendar for advocacy to Congress, which is the release of the president's budget. I know that's always different in the first year of an administration. Do you have any sense about the timing of that? I know it's supposed to come out first week in February, right? So I've got that held on my calendar. I'll be ready then. Is President Biden going to be ready on time?
I don't think so. Usually the first, president, when they come in, they don't propose a full budget anyway. They just more like a skinny budget or a basic budget that has their priorities. There is going to be a address to Congress on State of the Union, if you will, I think in February, and it'll probably be around, that's later in February. I'm not sure if it's been set for the date. Don't, Jessica, have you seen the date yet? Usually it's third or fourth week of February is my sense of where it will land this year. That's probably the timing in which they'll probably then start rolling out, either details of the agenda and the budget in that speech, and then the following week with the full details, possibly after that. My sense of kind of where we're going to see the timing of that. Interestingly enough, we'll see if Congress, if that coincides with where Congress is on trying to pass another relief package, right? So if going to my timing here of the Senate and House Democrats move forward on a budget resolution next week, and then try to do a reconciliation bill after the impeachment through the Senate, at least the House could go sooner, then you can see that kind of line up with, the president's speech to Congress right around the time they're trying to pass that first relief bill towards the third or fourth week of February. And if they do that, then that's kind of kick off that next round, and then the president's budget will be released, and then we'll kind of be looking ahead, as Jessica talks about what's the second phase or second round of legislation that President Biden wants to accomplish, and then they'll have. They do have, for this standpoint, they have two abilities to do two reconciliation bills this year, because they didn't pass a budget last year, so they can pass the FY21 budget now, finish that budget, finish that reconciliation bill, pass that, say, by March timeframe, and then move on to the regular FY22 looking ahead budget resolution in the March-April timeframe, and tee up another reconciliation bill, another budget process towards this summer. And so that's kind of, I think, where we'll see a larger package, infrastructure potentially, more spending. I don't think there's going to be an effort to raise taxes in this first bill. And the view is they want to still spend money and cut taxes to help stir the economy and the recovery. But then the second bill will probably be more aligned with, okay, we need to raise some revenue, realign the tax code to be more fair, pay for some of the things they want to do in that package. We're not going to pay for them in this first one, I don't think. So it'll be a whole different dynamic in that second big package sometime later this year, later this summer. Jessica, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would just emphasize, typically with a new administration, when the skinny bill gets released, a lot of it tends to be proposals from previous administrations. And so, you saw with the Obama administration, there were some similarities with the Clinton previous budget. So I think you'll see a lot of off-the-shelf proposals that'll be in there in kind of a slimmed down version. Remember that, the Office of Management and Budget, which helps with this process, there's still a lot of personnel decisions that need to be made, despite having a lot of those top tier positions already filled. And those are really the worker bees that will put out and formulate all of those ideas for budgets going forward.
Thank you. And thank you to the worker bees who are putting that work together. We know that the work of running a federal government is not always as glamorous as it looks. So we're grateful to them and to all of us worker bee advocates. We're grateful to you for being with us today. Thank you for joining us. We look forward to working with you in the days and weeks to come. Have a good afternoon.